Thanks for joining me today. I'm Nick Cooper, the General Secretary of the Asia Pacific Greens Federation, and I'm joined by Adam Bandt. Adam is the Parliamentary Leader of the Australian Greens. He was first elected to the lower house of the Australian Federal Parliament in 2010 and has won 3 more elections since then, and now holds the 3rd safest seat in the country, I believe. So thanks very much for joining us, Adam.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me.
So I have a number of questions that were submitted by our members from across the Asia Pacific region, but I first want to start with a general one. What does green politics mean to you?
Very simply, that we've got a planet with finite capacity on it, and we've got to learn to live within those means. And it means, especially at the moment, making sure that our society is more equal, but also more sustainable, and that we don't become the first generation in outside of wartime to basically hand over a worse planet and a worse standard of living to the people that come after us than the one that we inherited ourselves. So for me, it's about equality and sustainability. That is what sums up green politics to me.
And how did you come into green politics?
Look, I had a mum who was, I guess you might say, a practical environmentalist who taught me from a very early age that there's only one planet and that we've got to look after it, and a dad who was very much a strong social justice worker and campaigner. And he, I think, probably would have voted Labor all his life and been a Labor person through and through. And for me, I grew up with sort of those twin strands of compassion and equality, and also caring for our world sort of in me as a kid. And when I was at university, the first protest that I attended was a protest against nuclear warships that pulled into the port down in Fremantle. And we did a lot of our work, not only for those protests, but then when I started getting involved in campaigns against the rising cost of education, we did a lot of our work together with Greens senators in Western Australia. And Western Australia at the time was very much a place of like strong Greens representation, strong forest campaigns, strong anti-nukes campaigns. That's the milieu that I grew up in and sort of cut my teeth in as an activist. And it seemed only logical as time went on that I'd get involved and join the Greens. But it was the climate crisis and the science of climate change back in the mid-2000s that prompted me to quit my job as I was a partner in a law firm, and I was working in representing a lot of low-paid workers. And it was discovery sort of how advanced the climate crisis is, and thinking that politics was a way to do something about that. Led me to quit my job, start running in elections, and I wasn't successful the first couple of times I ran, but eventually was.
Well, unfortunately, some of those problems are still around, but it sounds from your history that there was the beginning of your time in politics really started with the grassroots, and this was one of the questions that we were asked. You're now the Parliamentary Leader of the Australian Greens, and our members are very interested in how the Australian Greens and the Parliamentary Party ensures that there are strong links between the grassroots membership and the elected representatives. And maybe you can talk about how you do that, what some of the challenges are, and what opportunities you see.
Yeah, as a general proposition, I think that governments and politicians can make change, but often only within the bounds that are set for them by social movements. And it's social movements that, when they're strong, and when the grassroots are strong, and when community movements are strong, that push parliamentarians to act and that open up the space for parliamentarians to act. And conversely, it's very, very difficult to achieve significant reform without a big level of grassroots support. And so I think for us, it's always, and for me, it's always about understanding that Parliament is only part of it, and that unless change comes from the ground up, then it will be limited in how long it lasts, and probably not as strong as it can be. But it's that, like history tells us, that it's big people-powered movements that help drive change. And so I think a big part of what we do as members of Parliament is continue to use our position and our resources to support grassroots organising and to support community organising, and also to understand that, I mean, I won my seat off because of a people-powered campaign back in 2010. We didn't have the same money that the others had. And we did it because we realised that as the Greens, one of the advantages that we had over the other parties was we were never going to get the big corporate donations, but we did have a people-powered movement. And so we've kept up the ethos that that people-powered movement can't just be something that happens at election times. And so what we continue to do is make sure that we, in between elections, that we're working with our party and the grassroots of our party to continue to run campaigns on the things that matter to us, not just during election times, but throughout the rest of the time. So we can't just continue to be focused on parliamentary work. It's got to be a grassroots-driven process, not just in terms of the policy that is set that determines what the Australian Greens and how we what policy we follow when we're in Parliament and what guides our vote. Not just our policy, but our day-to-day activity is one that is grassroots-led and campaign-focused.
So you mentioned one of the challenges there about not having the corporate donors of the big polluters, and it sounds like your focus is, I guess, being an extension of the movement that operates within Parliament, and using those resources to support the grassroots to build that broader social movement. Is that fair?
That's a part of it. That's definitely a part of it, and it's got to be an integral part of it, because that is how we will get change in Parliament, and it's how we'll get other parliamentarians to come over to our way of thinking when they can see that there's a groundswell of support behind a particular proposal, as opposed to it being something that we just put forward in Parliament. But of course, what we've also got to do in Parliament is push within Parliament to try to get changes that are going to make a difference to people in society, and that includes changes that will benefit social movements and make it easier for social movements to grow. So I think it's a rather than necessarily an extension, I think it's a symbiotic relationship that happens between political parties and social movements. And we've both got an interest in, on the progressive side of politics, in making sure each other is successful.
So changing tack for a moment, Australia likes to think of itself as reasonably influential in the world. It's obviously not the world's largest economy. We don't have the largest population. But we like to think that we have an outsized weight in international affairs. What do you think is Australia's role in building a greener world?
Well, we've certainly got an outsized weight in our pollution. When you take into account the amount of pollution Australia exports, we're the third largest exporter of fossil fuel pollution in the world. And this may not be understood more broadly, but Australia is a massive, massive exporter of fossil fuels, both in terms of thermal coal and also gas, where we are, if not now, we are on track to be the world's largest exporter of LNG. And we know that toxic methane, up to 86 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a climate gas, is when you take fracking into account, which is where a lot of the gas in Australia comes from and is planned to come from. We are talking about igniting climate bombs here in Australia. So one of Australia's major roles on the world stage at the moment is as an exporter of pollution, and as I say, the world's third largest. And if you took Australia's exported pollution into account, would be the sixth largest country. But as the third largest exporter, one of the biggest contributions that Australia can make on the world stage to fight for a greener planet, as you said, is to begin the process of reining in the pollution that we export. And that's something that we are pushing for very strongly here in Australia is for a phasing out of coal exports and gas exports as well. But this is where the Asia-Pacific relationship becomes especially critical, because some of the major countries that we export coal to, countries like Japan and China and South Korea, have all now set net zero emissions goals. Now, they're in between 2050 and 2060. So, and we can have a debate. I think those goals are too late, but nonetheless, they're the goals that those countries have set. But working backwards from that, one of the things that means is that Australia, those countries are going to have to decarbonise their electricity sectors early, because when you get your electricity sector running on 100% renewables, you can switch your cars and your trucks over to run on renewable electricity, and that's how you get your whole country to net zero. But you need to do electricity first so that you can power the rest of the economy. Now, when the penny hasn't yet dropped for Australia, that those countries that together make up 3/4 of our coal export market are now wanting to and eventually by the 2030s or 2040s going to get off coal. And so what we've got to do at the moment here in Australia, the fight that we're having, and we're calling on our international counterparts to help us in this, is to get the message through to the Australian government that the age of coal and gas is over, and that instead what we need to do is be exporting things like green hydrogen and exporting our sunlight to the rest of the world, and in particular to the Asia-Pacific region, through undersea cables, through exporting green hydrogen, through exporting green steel. So there's the more pressure that can be brought to bear on Australia to say, you've got to stop exporting your pollution to the rest of the world because it's damaging the rest of the world. There is a space for Australia to step into to become the major exporter of green energy in the world, a renewable energy superpower. But at the moment, we're not taking it. And until we take that opportunity, it's going to harm us in other respects. So at the moment, we've got the climate summits coming up, the International Climate Summit that Joe Biden is organising, for example, and we've got the COP at the end of the year. And EU is actively discussing carbon tariffs against countries like Australia that aren't taking strong enough action on climate. So increasingly, our fossil fuel export is becoming intertwined with our state and our place in the world and in the region. And we've got to take a greener path out of it in order to A, have credibility on the world stage, but B, stop climate collapse. And at the moment, we're not doing it, but the international community can play a big role, as they're starting to do, and as people even like Joe Biden are starting to do, to step up and start to push the pressure on Australia to make that domestic transformation so that it sends something else out to the rest of the world.
It sounds like coordination is going to be a big part of how we solve the climate crisis, or at least get through it. How do you think Green parties around the world can coordinate better on pushing for action on climate change and develop closer links with each other?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think we should have a greater understanding and greater connection between countries that have got strong, or that have got a lot of trading relationships, because in the case of Australia, as I've mentioned, one of the big things that we export is coal and gas, which is fast-tracking climate collapse. And I recently spoke, for example, at a Green New Deal conference being hosted in Korea, and virtually, of course, and this is during COVID times. And my plea to Korean legislators was, set us a timetable for when you are going to get to net zero, so that we can understand, work backwards and plan from that. And I think that's something that we should have greater coordination amongst Green parties and Green members of Parliament at whatever level, to start working out what pressure can be brought to bear to push countries at both ends of the trade exchange to move quickly to get out of fossil fuels and into renewables, or into things like green hydrogen. So I think in those instances, especially when you've got, because what we know is that money talks, and the if we leave it to individual countries, then the big and wealthy corporations and billionaires in those countries tend to have a very big sway. But when we can spread it to say, no, this is actually part of a global push, then I think that's one area that we should certainly look at supporting each other in a bit more. So identifying countries that are engaged in the fossil fuel trade and working out a coordinated strategy to switch over to something greener. It's the second thing that I think that is exciting that I'm seeing amongst green parties across the world is the willingness to tackle wealth inequality. We've just here released our plan to introduce a wealth tax on billionaires, so the country's first ever billionaires tax, and it is getting really good reception. And in New Zealand, they have been talking about a form of wealth tax at their last election, and in Europe, in places like Germany, the Greens are very forward-looking in terms of tackling wealth inequality, including through taxation. And I think if we can come up, and we're seeing this starting to happen again at a government level, governments are starting to look at how to introduce, for example, a minimum corporate tax rate. I think greater coordination amongst Green parties about how to reduce wealth inequality through the kinds of taxes on billionaires and big corporations, for example, in a way that stops them just shifting profits and moving from one country to another, but allows us to instead get the money that we need to fund the services that we need and stop the massive power and influence that these billionaires and big corporations have would be good.
The economic situation as it currently structured definitely plays a big part in terms of who has power and who has the ability to make choices about the future of our environment. Some people have proposed a universal basic income as a way forward. What do you think about the idea and the impact that it would have on societies and the environment?
Yeah, so it's an exciting idea, and in Australia, we're taking parts of that idea and parts of other ideas, and we are pushing for what we're calling a jobs and income guarantee, where government is able to say to everyone in the country, you will not fall below a certain minimum income. Plus, if you want to go above that, there's a guaranteed job for you working on a big nation-building, planet-saving project, like getting the country running on 100% renewables, building enough public housing so that everyone's got a roof over their head, restoring our environment that at the moment is facing collapse. As for on the income side of it, we like the universal component of it. It's the basic bit that I think needs a little bit more thought. So the universal component is really exciting. The idea that no one falls through the cracks and that there's a minimum level of income that you don't go below is very, very important. And in Australia, for example, there are many instances where the safety net, so-called safety net, has got big holes in it, and certain people don't even qualify for it. So many people do fall through the cracks, and I know that in many other countries, the safety net and social security system isn't even as widespread as it is in Australia. But so we want the idea of you've got a minimum income and you can't go below it. If you start to earn, one of the differences with and it's a livable income, right? And so it's not just a basic income, it's a livable income that is above the poverty line, which is one of the key differences, I think, between our approach and a UBI. We're not talking about something that is just a lower level payment that you then are expected to add money on top of, but we're talking about a livable income that everyone is guaranteed. But of course, obviously, and everyone is entitled to it, but if you end up earning $100,000 a year, you don't get the livable income as well. You pay some of it back through the tax system or through the transfer system. So that's one of the differences between what we're proposing and a UBI. So universal, but we've gone for universal and livable rather than universal and basic.
On a similar note, there's also been growing interest in modern monetary theory as an economic approach to replace neoliberalism. Some of the things you've mentioned sound quite familiar from a modern monetary theory framework, such as the jobs guarantee. What do you think about MMT?
Well, I think one of the things that people who support MMT should be advocating as strongly as they possibly can is a jobs guarantee. and a push to say we can have full employment. And I think it's important for a number of reasons, not only because high levels of insecure employment like we're seeing in this country and underemployment can really devastate people's lives, but also because it helps make society more equal, because one of the big problems that we've seen over the last 30 or 40 years is the rise of neoliberalism and the rise of insecurity. Risk gets pushed downwards onto people. People's lives become much more insecure and difficult to plan. But meanwhile, big corporations continue to make more and more money. And I think one of the things, but despite all of that, political parties, the establishment political parties always run on campaign of, oh, everyone needs a job. One of the good things about the idea of a jobs guarantee is that it takes them at their word and says, okay, well, governments can employ people and they should employ people. And there's so many projects that we need to be employing people on that will deliver a lasting benefit to the country and help us tackle the climate crisis. So let's get cracking, let's get on with it. And it forces them into the position, it shows the hypocrisy of their own position. So I think that a lot of the things that we will be advocating for are consistent with that. I think it is easier. I guess my one message to MMT advocates would be you are more likely to get people accepting the argument that you are making by leading with the employment and the jobs side of it and saying it is we can have a jobs guarantee, we can have full employment, than by running the argument that can be caricatured by others as saying, oh, you just need to print money and everything will be fine. I know it's more complicated than that. I know it's more complicated from the MMT point of view, but the bandwidth that we have as progressives to change the debate and to argue is often very limited. And so I pick the best argument you can run with that. And for me, that's taking the idea of a jobs guarantee and continuing to push it. I think it's going to get a much better reception and open doors to talk about some of the other components of things like MMT as well. One side note I would say is that looking at the response to the response of central banks during the COVID crisis, we are now going to be in a situation where the Reserve Bank here in Australia is going to have somewhere, and I stand to be corrected on this, but the Reserve Bank in Australia is going to be carrying somewhere in the order of 2/3 of the government's debt that was generated to get it through the COVID crisis. So like, you've actually got, in many respects, some of the key elements of MMT in practice on display right here, right now, happening in real time. And what's interesting is that even some of the more conservative and mainstream economic commentators have started to pick it up. The Reserve Bank and others are pedaling at 1,000,000 miles an hour to say, oh no, we're not implementing anything like MMT in practice. But it is very interesting to watch as they in fact do in practice what many MMT theorists have been saying is and can be done, but they're desperate to call it something else, which I find is an interesting observation coming out of the crisis.
Adam, I know you have to go to an economics committee quite soon. I've just got 2 more questions if we have time. First, what role do you think technology will play in solving the financial, social, and environmental challenges facing the Asia-Pacific region and really the world?
Well, technology will play a crucial role. I mean, technology played a big role in getting us into the problem with the rise of fossil fuels and combustion engines. Technology can play a big role in fixing the problem, and we are seeing now both on the social front, but also the engineering and economic and energy front, a growing a demonstrated ability to solve the problems that we're facing through the appropriate use of technology. So I think technology stands to play a big role, just as it played a big role in getting us into the problem. For me, the real question, though, is how are we going to exercise effective social control and direction over that technology so that it's used for the right purposes rather than being used to make these crises worse. And we see that, for example, with the use of, with algorithms and the use of, we've seen it in government, for example, where here in Australia, people got penalised and taken to court for debts that didn't exist, but because a computer program said that those debts existed, they got taken, that many of them got persecuted and hounded until the government was forced to abandon the scheme, which was all algorithm driven, but basically because it was illegal and they were forced to abandon it. One of the things that we need going into this next period is a better relationship with technology. So I think technology is going to be critical, but we need a better relationship with technology. We need to manage what it's doing to the world of work. We need to manage what it's doing to our lives. We need to manage how it relates to the upbringing of our kids. And we need to manage what it's doing to the destruction or the saving of our planet. And for me, I'm really interested in building up those social institutions, including laws through Parliament, but also giving people power in their lives and in their workplaces to have more control over how technology is used. So for me, it's not for or against technology. I think technology plays a critical role, and accelerating technology will play an absolutely vital role. What we need is proper social control over that technology so it's used to make the planet more habitable and make people's lives better, rather than just making big corporations and billionaires a bit more money.
And the last question, take it anywhere you want it. Why do you do this work?
Because I think that it's critical, it's important. This is scientists calling this the critical decade. Last decade was also called the critical decade by some scientists as being one of our last chances to turn the ship around, to avoid climate change becoming an unstoppable chain reaction where feedback loops will kick in, and no matter what we do over coming decades, we won't be able to rein in the climate crisis becoming an unstoppable chain reaction. So we've got to act, and for me, it's about making sure that we do everything we possibly can to ensure that the world is livable for us, and also for the people who come after us, and the billions of animals and other species that we share this amazing planet with. So for me, it's about making sure that we seize this really crucial historic moment to make sure we create a livable planet and a livable society, both so that we live within the bounds of our means environmentally, but also that we make our society more equal. So I feel like this is a really critical time in history, and I want to be part of making sure that we end up going down the right track.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for your time, Adam. That was Adam Bandt, the Parliamentary Leader of the Australian Greens and Federal Member for the seat of Melbourne. And you've been listening to me, Nick Cooper, General Secretary of the Asia Pacific Greens Federation. Thank you very much for your time.